I'm John Eisner. I'm the artistic director of the Lark and one of three co-founders almost 25 years ago. And I'm really delighted to see all of you here for this pilot program, which is really built around discussion, which has really been the fabric of what we've done for many, many years. But this is an experiment in actually looking at writers working on process and talking about deeply held convictions and personal experience with each other as part of their process, as they are in process, as well as with a community of people who really care about the art we make and the social issues that it sort of helps to tremble. I'm going to take just a minute, because it's a new program, to make sure that some of the people here who are new to us are pretty clear about what the Lark does. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lloyd, who is going to moderate the panel, and who is himself a playwright. And he'll introduce the rest of the writers here and the actors who are here to help us hear some of their work. And Lloyd is also for many, many years, the director of artistic programs as well. But I just wanted to make it pretty clear. What we do is pretty simple, but it is essential to the ecology of the theater. We are an international and intercultural creative lab for playwrights. We provide writers with funding, space, collaborators, audiences, professional connections, and the freedom to drive their own creative processes. At our core, we're a platform for storytellers from historically marginalized communities, where we work to make sure artists feel free to express themselves fully and honestly as part of the creative process and to avoid external pressures. We believe the most important and relevant stories emerge this way. We're also advocates. Plays developed at Lark go on to productions at give or take 100 theaters a year. In both of the past 2 years, plays written at the Lark have won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Tonight's panel is part of a pilot program called Project on Tyranny. This project is an experiment in tracking a number of plays in process that relate to the timely themes of tyranny, abuse of power, and marginalization. We don't really believe in telling what writers want to write or commissioning them to write about particular topics, but it's fascinating, to me at least, to understand what people are actually writing about. That's what makes theater so interesting. This is our chance to be part of a conversation about the writer's process and thinking about the world and how their world affects us. We're especially interested in thinking about whose voices are being included in the conversation and whose are not. I'm about to turn you over to Lloyd, but first, in the spirit of inclusion, I want to take a moment to acknowledge some history. You may know that the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture has launched a national initiative to open events and gatherings by acknowledging the traditional indigenous inhabitants of the land, as they do in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and among tribal nations in the United States. Acknowledgement is a simple and powerful way of showing respect and a step toward correcting the stories and practices that erase indigenous people's history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. So as an organization dedicated to providing space for artists from many cultural backgrounds, we want to acknowledge that the building where we gather to share stories is on the traditional land of the Lenape people. We pay our respects to the Lenape and other indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, and to their elders who have lived here, who live here now, and who will live here in the future. We extend that respect to all indigenous people who join us for programs at the Lark. And we're delighted that you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Lloyd.
Thanks, John, and also I want to thank Lord Schechter for providing the open captioning for us this evening. I want to start by going over the format for tonight's event, which is going to be divided into 2 acts. In Act 1, we'll be hearing from these 5 extraordinary writers as they delve into tonight's theme on tyranny through a series of questions around the practice of their art in navigating that theme, and through the specific example of works that they've been developing here at the Lark. And we'll be hearing brief excerpts from each of these plays, in some cases read by the writers themselves, and in some cases read by beloved members of our acting community here at the Lark who are with us today. I'm expecting that this first act will run about an hour, after which point we'll take a 10-minute intermission. You'll notice that in your program there was a little blue card. We also noticed that some of those blue cards were falling out of the programs. So if you need extra, there's plenty more at the box office where you checked in. But if you have a question you would like to ask the panel, at the intermission, fill that out. There are going to be members of our artistic staff right here at the exits to gather those. And when we come back for Act 2, those members of the staff will be curating those questions and then posing them to us for a more freewheeling and open-ended conversation that I'm anticipating will run about 45 minutes. A couple of acknowledgments before we begin. First, this is a big theme. And as the Lark is a process-based organization that values the journey more than the product, it's inevitable that we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions or explore all of the ideas to any sense of completion. So our goal here is to spark ongoing dialogue rather than to arrive at any kind of final word. And hopefully we will all leave here wishing for more. Another important acknowledgement is that there are perspectives which are not represented on this panel. Obviously it's impossible to convene a group of 5 that's going to be representative of all possible viewpoints. But I mentioned it now so that we can all be very mindful that we're engaged in a conversation around 5 really robust case studies of art in action, but that there are many, many more examples out there in the ecology of this kind of work. One other thing, your program does say that Lisa Jessie Peterson will be joining us tonight, and unfortunately because of some unexpected obligations out of town, she passes along her regrets for not being able to join us. And the last thing I'm going to say before we dive in is that maybe the biggest reason that I love my job is that I get to be in proximity to artists who just really truly inspire me. Not just in their artistry, but in their sense of hope, of how their work can impact the world. We're living in an intense moment in history. And if you're like me, you probably have moments where you feel powerless, or where you wonder how you can contribute to the type of cultural shifts that this world is really desperately in need of. And so tonight we get to hang out with writers who are on the front lines of those cultural conversations. And it's my privilege to welcome them and all of you to an evening on the state of the world and the artist role within it. So please turn off your cell phone. A lot of information, like biographical information about all of these writers is in your program. I'm not going to do elaborate introductions, but I think that we'll get to know a lot about these writers and the work they've been doing as we go. But I'm going to start with you, Rajiv. And I think that on this subject, like one of the first things that occurred to me was John, who we just heard from, tells this story about a reading of Cards at the Taj, your play, in translation into Russian in Moscow. And there's a line in the play where one of the characters says, "Fuck the kid." And in that reading in Moscow, I wasn't there, but the way I heard it described is the audience just kind of tensed up and began to spontaneously applaud this idea of "fuck the kid" in a sense that felt very dangerous, but very powerful. And I want to ask you about that moment. I checked in with Rajiv earlier today, being like, "Hey, is it okay if I ask you about that moment?" And he said, "Yeah." And you mentioned that it made the hairs stand up on the back of your head. And so I'm curious about what that felt like, why you think it had the kind of impact on you.
Yeah, so this was in September of 2016, so it was about 2 months before the insanity of our current political situation became a reality, and at that point, that seemed like a very unlikely thing. And yet we were there in September. I was there with 2 other playwrights, Robert Askins and Andrea Tome, and our plays were being translated into Russian, and we were working all week on them with actors and directors and translators. And it's always, I've done this with the Lark in a few different cultural settings, and it's always this kind of incredible way of of cross-cultural understanding through the text that you've created, and through these actors and translators understanding something more about it. And in that moment, we it was not a line that I ever anticipated anyone reacting in this way to. The play is about 2 imperial guards in India in the 1600s, and at one point in the play, one of the guards, having a bit of an emotional meltdown, has decided that he wants to betray his oath, and when given the opportunity, kill the king. And he's trying to, enlist the aid of his friend. And his friend is like, "You're crazy, you can't do that." He's like, and the line that comes forward is that if the king decrees that beauty is dead, then beauty is dead. And then this character says, "Well then fuck the king, beauty shall live." He starts chanting it louder and louder. And in that moment, the audience started to applaud. And I had never, again, I hadn't thought about it as a particularly transgressive line, and yet in that setting it was, in part because it was clear what people were applauding about. And then also, like, there's an added thing about in Russia, it's actually illegal to swear on stage. It's illegal to use profanity on stage. And that was going to be a problem, if not for me, then certainly for Hand to God. But what was interesting is that there was some kind of weird loophole that they had assured us this was fine, that like, since it was a unpaid, an unticketed reading, stage reading, those laws didn't apply. And we were like, okay, great, we'll go with that. And then everyone's applauding about fuck the king, and the hair stood on the back of my neck, in part because of that way that any writer feels that if the audience is engaging into that degree, but the other way, it's like, oh, we're all going to be arrested here. Like, this is really dangerous. And I don't know. What's interesting to me about that play is that it's had some success, a modicum of success in the United States, but it's the one play of mine that's done internationally more than any play of mine, and it seems to have found an audience internationally in a way that it hasn't responded to in this country.
You've written on tyranny quite a lot, like in Guards de Taj with Shah Jahan, in Describe the Night with respect to Putin, in Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo with respect not just to the Bush administration, but also Saddam Hussein, and even from the tiger's perspective, the tyranny of God. And I'm wondering, like, just through all of these explorations on different forms of tyranny in your work, where that impulse comes from, and over the course of those multiple works, what have you learned over the course, like how has your relationship to that subject changed?
I think that when I was in graduate school at NYU, the first year and a half or so that I was there, up to, I was writing really bad things. And bad things meaning boring things, meaning things that didn't have any stakes, any kind of like cultural relevance, any political relevance. They were apolitical in many ways. They were more studies and dialoguing. And I was really having a hard time hooking my claws into something. And I finally had a professor who really kind of sat me down and was like kind of pointing out like the world is really messed up right now. And so what you're writing means nothing. And this was at the start of the Iraq War, during the W's administration. And that's when I started, I was like, oh, it was something of like, I was given permission to engage on a global level. I was engaging on a personal level. And my life's been pretty boring. And so once I was given permission to say, you can write a play in which Uday Hussein is a character. You can write a play in which Vladimir Putin is a character. You can write a play where a tiger talks to God. I mean, that opened up something in me. And I think that writing politically, overtly or inovertly, if that's a word, is a real boon to writers, because it's like suddenly you're dealing with stakes that really mean something. And I find it very liberating when I find myself in a writing process like that, because to put it very bluntly, in a very kind of like writerly way, like the bad guys are real bad, and they're coming for you. And that is a real, from a purely writing perspective, you kind of want that, because that's dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of, like you say, that your life was boring, and I know that you spent 3 years in Senegal with the Peace Corps prior to your going to graduate school. And just in the past several years, with respect to your work in global exchange programming through the Lark and otherwise, in Moscow and Romania, other places as well, just what the experience of working in a global context, and in a lot of ways, as a member of the Lark's Board of Trustees, as a leader within the artistic community here, you're an ambassador for a type of artistic cultural expression when you're in these places, and just what your experience in engaging in that way with the world, and how that manifests just in terms of the potency and aspiration of what you're working to.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 3 years in the Peace Corps in Senegal, and it was very important to who I am as a person, and it was kind of the best years of my life in some ways, and deeply interesting, but not necessarily like something for me to immediately write about. But as I've worked with the Lark, with these international programs in Romania, in Russia, in Mexico, I have really felt a symmetry between the Peace Corps work and the work that we were able to do with the Lark as sort of artistic ambassadors. And I think it's really important that sort of work that I did with those actors in Moscow, working with them for about 10 days on this translation, working out little tidbits of language, working out what this play means to me, what it means to them, why it means something to them. Suddenly there's this sort of natural diplomatic bridge between artists that opens up something that you wouldn't get by just traveling to another country. And I have found that my relationships with the artists in these countries that I've been to through the Lark have not only been sustained over the years, but are continue to be fruitful, and people that I truly love and respect. And so this is like, I always said about the Peace Corps is that the Peace Corps can't do much damage because we don't have enough power. Peace Corps volunteers work on such a grassroots level, but there are all these little worker bees like out there in the world, making connections that sometimes last a lifetime, and sometimes change the way people think about their own world, the United States, Americans as a people, and I feel like we, on a much smaller level, but still in that same sort of grassroots level, are able to achieve that in the international work the Lark has been able to do.